Welcome back to the deep dive. If our last deep dive was all about the sheer, desperate act of survival during the War of 1812, today we're jumping into what came next.
Right.
We're charting the 45 chaotic, formative years that immediately followed, from about 1815 right up to 1860.
And this era, was anything but peaceful. It was defined by this constant unrest. But it wasn't just one kind of unrest.
That's the key, isn't it?
It really is. The sources for this period show you're looking at two completely different stories, two foundational tracks really unfolding at the same time across British North America.
So in the East, you have this settled political world.
Exactly. In the East, you see this bitter, generation-long political struggle. Sometimes it gets bloody, and it's all about fighting for just basic democratic accountability against a really rigid, entrenched colonial elite.
And then you go, what, 4,000 kilometers west?
Yeah, way out in the vast, almost completely unmapped territory of Rupert's Land.
And there you have a literal, brutal corporate civil war.
Fought with canoes, muskets, political sabotage. It's wild. And that conflict, almost by accident, results in the dramatic emergence of a powerful new force, political, economic, and military.
The Métis Nation.
The Métis Nation.
So our mission today is to try and weave these two threads together. We need to understand the ruthless violence of the fur trade wars, the surprisingly harsh political uprisings in the Canadas, and then, the final achievement of self-government.
Because all of that laid this incredibly volatile, unpredictable groundwork for the country that would eventually start to come together in the 1860s. We're really looking for the why behind all that chaos.
Okay, let's start by unpacking the immediate aftermath of the war, just to tie that off.
Let's do it.
The War of 1812 officially ends with the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. We established that the colonies, Upper and Lower Canada, they survived.
They did, aided by the British garrison and, crucially, their indigenous allies.
Yeah.
They successfully held the borders against multiple American attempts at conquest.
So it was a victory for the British North American project, yes. But what was the immediate cost?
Well, survival was definitely achieved for the settlers and for the crown.
Right.
But that victory was, without a doubt, a Pyrrhic one for the oldest inhabitants of the continent. The sources are so consistent on this point.
So while the British and Canadians held the borders, the true long-term losers were the indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. Their strategic power was just decimated.
That's a huge point that I think gets glossed over a lot.
It does.
The Pan-Indigenous Front, which had successfully held back American expansion for decades, it just shattered.
Completely. The Confederacy, led by Tecumseh, fell apart entirely with his death in 1813. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a political loss. It was a physical and an ideological catastrophe for First Nation sovereignty in the whole region.
So what did that look like on the ground? How did the relationship with the British change?
Well, before 1815, the relationship between the British and their indigenous allies was one of strategic necessity. It was an alliance.
Right. Shared goals.
Shared goals, symbolized by lavish gift-giving, shared ceremonies, and a real acknowledgement of indigenous military power. After the war, that changes profoundly.
The strategic necessity just evaporates.
It wanes significantly now that the U.S. threat is, for the moment, contained.
So all those commitments that underpin the alliances for centuries, promises about land protection, resource access, consultation, they suddenly just go stale.
They do. And in practical terms, within the next decade, that strategic partnership transforms. In the eyes of the British authorities, it becomes something much closer to guardianship.
Guardianship. That word implies a massive power shift.
A massive, catastrophic loss of influence for First Nations in the region. Practically, it meant the British felt way less obligation to defend indigenous land claims from settler encroachment.
Or to even engage in meaningful diplomatic consultation.
Right. The focus shifted from securing military allies to just managing populations.
That distinction from partnership to guardianship is so vital. It immediately changed the entire power dynamic around land and resources.
The British were basically signaling that the era of treating indigenous nations as sovereign co-partners in North America was coming to an end.
It was a huge turning point.
It really was. It set the groundwork for the displacement and the reserve systems that would characterize the rest of the 19th century. Indigenous groups were no longer seen as these essential counterweights to the Americans.
They were just domestic issues.
Domestic issues to be managed by colonial administrators.
And while those indigenous alliances were dissolving in the East, the two big colonial powers, Britain and the United States, were moving fast to carve up the continent diplomatically.
With surprising speed, yeah. Immediately after the war, in 1817, You get the Rush-Bagot Agreement.
Which was critical.
So critical. It was this piece of early peacekeeping that successfully demilitarized the Great Lakes. It restricted both sides to only having police vessels.
Which would have drastically reduced the military friction along what had been the most volatile border on the continent.
Exactly. And then they draw the literal line in the sand.
Defining the spheres of influence in that vast interior.
The boundary gets extended along the 49th parallel. It runs from Lake of the Woods all the way out to the Rocky Mountains.
You know, it's interesting. You'd ask why the British even bothered with these diplomatic moves if their commitments to indigenous sovereignty were fading.
And the answer is simple. They were managing the American threat. That demarcation, 49th parallel, it looks diplomatic on the surface, but it's really about defining economic and imperial control for the decades to come.
And this demarcation directly impacts that immense fur trading territory to the west, Rupert's Land.
Which was, at that exact moment, descending into what the sources basically describe as total anarchy.
Right. So the governments are drawing lines on maps in the east, while thousands of kilometers away, the only authority that matters is the barrel of a musket.
Wielded by two massive corporate rivals.
Let's pivot to the west then. Rupert's Land. This territory is just, almost unimaginable in scale. The fur trade isn't just an economy, it's the only economy.
And it was controlled by two corporate giants fighting what sounds less like competition and more like a low-grade civil war.
It was a corporate battleground, fought with, staggering brutality.
Absolutely. On one side, you've got the Hudson's Bay Company, the HBC, the old established monopoly, chartered by the Crown way back in 1670.
They were London-based, often called sleepy or the gentlemen adventurers.
Yeah, their traditional model was to wait for indigenous traders to come to their posts on the shores of Hudson Bay. Very passive.
And their competitor was much more aggressive.
Oh, yeah. The Northwest Company, the NWC, or the Nor'westers, based in Montreal, these guys were totally different. A highly aggressive, entrepreneurial, profit-sharing consortium.
Made up of Scottish and Canadian traders, mostly.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
And their business model was revolutionary compared to the HBCs. The NWC pioneered the inland routes. They used these massive canoe brigades to push deep into the continent.
And the key was their commission-based system, right?
That was the game changer. Their partners and traders could make immense fortunes based on the number of furs they got. It compensated for the brutally hard work and the long distances.
Whereas the HBC was just a salaried structure.
A salaried structure that just wasn't suited to this new, hyper-competitive environment.
And the sources are. They're visceral about this rivalry. It's described as ruthless and a bloody corporate civil war. How violent did it actually get?
It was essentially lawless. They weren't just undercutting prices, they were seizing supplies, burning rival posts to the ground.
Arresting each other.
Attacking and arresting company men on trumped-up charges, and sometimes just leading them to starve in the wilderness.
Oh, wow.
Some historians have even likened the intensity and the personal nature of it to Scottish clan warfare because of all the Highland Scots involved on both sides. This wasn't a clash of economics. It was a clash of corporate cultures determined to just eliminate the competition by any means necessary.
And this incredible intensity led to some severe social problems in the Northwest, primarily alcohol.
Alcohol is a trade good and a weapon. The figures are staggering. We see alcoholism reaching its absolute peak during this period.
How high did it go?
Liquor imports surged from an average of about 9,600 gallons in the 1790s to over 21,000 gallons in 1803 alone.
And that wasn't a side effect, it was a strategy.
A calculated strategy. Both companies used liquor to debase indigenous prices and gain loyalty, which just fueled the chaos among traders and their indigenous allies alike.
What was the human toll beyond the violence? Was there a sort of moral erosion that the traders themselves noticed?
Absolutely. The violence was so pervasive that one trader, a guy named Wenzel, writing around 1807, he lamented that the decline in the trade wasn't just competition. It was the sheer death toll of both native peoples and Europeans.
What did he conclude?
He concluded that the trade had, and this is a quote, almost totally abolished every humane sentiment in both Christian and Indian breast. The situation got so desperate that the British government was forced to pass something called the Canada Jurisdiction Act, which was just them acknowledging that the trade had spiraled completely out of control and that the law had to try and catch up.
But out of this violent, lawless crucible, this place where humane sentiment was abolished, something entirely new and powerful was being forged.
Right.
The distinct identity and economy of the Métis Nation, sometimes called the Bois Brûlés.
This is where history gets really fascinating. The Métis, these mixed indigenous and European kin networks with deep roots in the fur trade, they emerged as a self-sustaining culture.
With their own distinct markers.
Clear markers that differentiated them from both the European traders and the various First Nations groups.
And the most immediate, clearest sign of this emerging nationhood was the language itself, Medjugorje.
Medjugorje is remarkable. It appeared around 1800, and linguists find it truly unique. It's a genuine mixed language, which is different from a pidgin or a Creole. You see a complete structural fusion of two parent languages.
How does that work?
It combines French nouns, articles, and adjectives, things related to religion, administration, objects, with these incredibly complex, inflected Cree verb phrases.
So French nouns and Cree verbs.
Yeah, and the Cree verbs are often related to action, motion, the hunt.
That structure seems to perfectly reflect their reality. They're inheritors of the French trading world, but their existence is built on the active process of Cree life and the buffalo hunt.
Precisely. Its language is a direct map of cultural fusion. It is a marker of nationhood because it is unique to them, and it emerged organically from their way of life.
And their technology was just as indispensable to the NWC's economy.
The Red River Cart, a true marvel of frontier engineering and adaptation.
These were the massive two-wheeled, ox-drawn vehicles.
Huge spoked wheels, which meant they were amphibious. You could disassemble them, strap the wheels to the bottom, and turn the flatbed into a raft across rivers.
And they were made without any metal.
Crucially, yes, all wooden pegs and leather straps, so they were easily repairable with natural materials on the fly.
I have to ask about the sound. All the sources mention the sound.
Oh, the sound was notorious. Because there were no metal parts, the axles were never greased. Grease or tallow would just collect dust and grit and grind the wooden wheel away.
So what did that sound like?
An ear-piercing, constant screech that you could hear for miles across the prairie. Witnesses compared it to thousands of fingernails on 1,000 blackboards, or the noise of 1,000 hungry wolves.
Imagine hundreds of those traveling together.
It was the sound of the Red River economy.
And that economy was built on one specific thing. Pemmican.
Pemmican, the high-protein mash of dried, pounded bison, rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries. It was literally the staff of life.
And the essential fuel for the fast-moving, long-distance NWC canoe brigades.
The NWC could not survive on the plains without it.
So this creates a massive symbiotic business relationship. The Métis are providing the literal caloric energy that powers the entire Northwest Company trading network.
It was huge. Estimates suggest millions of kilograms of pemmican were consumed each year. The Métis economy centered on these enormous, organized bison hunts, where indigenous women played an absolute central role in processing and manufacturing the pemmican on an industrial scale.
So neither the NWC structure nor the growing Métis economy could survive without the other.
Not at all. And this massive essential food supply was exactly what Lord Selkirk was banking on disrupting when he moved in to carve up the land for settlement.
Which brings us right to the core conflict, the Red River colony crisis. Lord Selkirk, a wealthy Scottish philanthropist and a major HBC shareholder, gets a massive land grant for what he called Assiniboia.
He intended it for displaced Highland Scots and retired HBC men. His vision was one of agrarian settlement, not nomadic hunting.
The problem was the scale and the location.
The scale. His grant was 4 times the size of New Brunswick, and its absolutely critical geographic location. It was imposed directly across the NWC's main access roads.
And more importantly, right across the Métis hunting territories and the pemmican trade routes.
The Bois Brûlés relied on movement and the buffalo hunt. They were not fixed farmers. This was a direct threat.
And the conflict just explodes when the HBC governor, Miles MacDonald, issues the Pemmican Proclamation.
In the middle of winter 1814, during a severe famine.
This wasn't a subtle move.
No, it was an economic declaration of war dressed up as a famine measure. MacDonald banned the export of pemmican from the region for a year.
The stated goal was to feed the HBC settlers.
But the real goals were threefold. Protect the settlement, sure, but also ruin the NWC by cutting off their essential fuel source, and impoverish the Métis by destroying their only export market.
And the Métis considered the land's resources theirs. They couldn't possibly tolerate this.
It was an immediate threat to their nationhood and their economic survival. The NWC, seeing their supply chain cut, immediately allied with the furious Métis.
And the simmering tension reaches its inevitable bloody climax.
At the Battle of Seven Oaks on June 19, 1816.
Describe that clash.
A large party of Métis, famously led by the young and very capable Cuthbert Grant, a seasoned fur trader and military leader. They intercepted the Red River Settlement's governor, Robert Semple, and a party of his HBC men.
And the clash was short.
Devastatingly short and decisive. Semple and 19 of his HBC men were killed in the shootout. The Métis suffered only one fatality.
And the sources all confirm the profound significance of this. It was a key military, commercial, and cultural turning point.
It was so much more than just a skirmish. On a corporate level, it pushed the rivalry to its absolute legal and financial limits. You had arrests and counter-arrests happening all across the West.
But culturally, for the Métis.
Culturally, Seven Oaks solidified the rise of the Métis as a militarized force on the plains. Previous historical accounts, often written by HBC sympathizers, tried to paint the Brûlés as just pawns of the NWC.
And this proved otherwise.
It proved they had independent agency to act militarily and politically in defense of their own economic interests which, for the moment, just happened to align perfectly with the Nor'westers.
So the violence was just unsustainable. The whole conflict ends in 1821 with a forced merger of the two companies. What finally brought them together after decades of murder and mayhem?
Several factors all converged at once. Sheer exhaustion from the fighting, the massive legal costs, and the sudden death of Lord Selkirk in 1820 certainly played a role.
But it was more than that.
It was ultimately driven by environmental and social collapse. The entire Northwest was suffering massive social crises, plagues, famine, severe climate change. It had brought the entire fur trade near total operational failure.
So the British government just stepped in.
They were completely exasperated by the chaos and the threat of a total system collapse, so they insisted on a merger.
The new unified company kept the more historical, sleepy name, the Hudson's Bay Company. But which business model did they adopt? The HBC's or the aggressive NWC model?
And this is where it gets really interesting from a corporate history perspective. They kept the old, respectable name, but they adopted the NWC's aggressive business model of shareholding traders.
So the Nor'westers kind of won, in a way.
Their model did. George Simpson, the man who had run the new HBC for decades, he was the one who made that NWC-style model work. But the merger had profound consequences for the Montreal community that had financed the NWC.
Oh, so.
The headquarters and the entire axis of trade shifted to the HBC's traditional Rote York factory on Hudson Bay. This was, and the sources call it this, a drastic blow to the entire Montreal business establishment.
The NWC had represented the peak of Montreal's continental economic influence.
And now that economic power was gone, shifting back to London via Hudson Bay, the new HBC also downsized ruthlessly. They professionalized the whole operation and fired over 1,000 surplus personnel in the first 4 years.
Creating mass unemployment and displacement.
A huge social shock.
So as this corporate battle ends in the West, we simultaneously see the escalation of a very different kind of battle in the East, a political and cultural civil war.
The contrast could not be starker. While the West was defined by this lawless, shifting series of alliances and economic mobility, the East was defined by incredibly stiff, rigid political systems.
Held firmly in the hands of entrenched oligarchies.
And the struggle there wasn't over furs. It was over democratic accountability.
And this political system, the one they inherited from the Constitutional Act of 1791, was intentionally designed to make sure the elected representatives had very little real power.
Exactly. The appointed councils, the Legislative Council, and the Executive Council, they were the real instruments of power. The elected assembly could vote until they were blue in the face, but the governor and his councils could just ignore them.
Let's name the cabals that controlled them, because their power was so personal. In Lower Canada, centered in Montreal and Quebec City, you had the Château Clique.
The clique was a highly influential, tight-knit group of Anglophone, Protestant merchants, landowners, and office holders. Big names like John Molson and James McGill were crucial components. They saw themselves as the British or Tory party.
And their agenda was fundamentally assimilationist.
Explicitly so. They sought the political and cultural elimination of the French Catholic population, which was still the majority in Lower Canada.
They saw French culture, the French civil law, the seigneurial system as just backward.
A weakness, holding the colony back. And crucially, after the Napoleonic Wars, they were terrified of a reassertion of French political power or influence in the colony. They believed British rule was essential for progress.
Okay, meanwhile, upriver in Upper Canada, you've got the same problem, but with different actors. This is the Family Compact.
The Compact was a Tory Anglican elite. based mostly in York, which is now Toronto, and they were devoted to suppressing any Republican tendencies spilling over from the U.S.
And their power was completely interwoven throughout society.
They perpetuated their oligarchy through massive patronage networks and, critically, control of public land, most notoriously the vast clergy reserves.
What made them so powerful on a day-to-day level?
They controlled every single lever of power. They were the judges, the land commissioners, the senior civil servants, the appointed members of the Legislative Council, and often the Anglican clergy itself.
So if you were an immigrant who needed to register a land title,
You were dealing with someone connected to the compact. If you needed a judicial decision or a bank loan, same thing. And they used every instrument of power they had, including sheer intimidation.
like in 1826 with William Lyon Mackenzie.
Precisely. To silence the growing voices of dissent, a gang of Tories went to Mackenzie's offices and physically threw his printing presses, his literal means of public communication, into Lake Ontario.
That's not a legal action, that's political vandalism.
It was an act of political terror designed to enforce conformity.
But this oppression, combined with these liberal revolutionary trends spreading globally, it fueled an organized reform movement.
It did. And in Lower Canada, the leader of the party Patriot was Louis-Joseph Papineau.
Who is a deeply complex, sometimes contradictory figure.
Very much so. On one hand, he was highly progressive for his time. He successfully worked to secure full civil rights for Jewish people in Lower Canada, which was an anomaly in the British Empire.
And he was a passionate defender of the elected assembly's rights against the appointed executive.
But he was also fiercely protective of the French civil law, the coutume de Paris, and the seigneurial system, which was basically a remnant of feudal land tenure.
He saw those as cultural defenses.
Crucial cultural defenses against the Anglophone assimilationist drive of the Château Clique. Ultimately, his core beliefs was that true representative government, where the executive is responsible to the elected assembly, was the only real long-term guarantee for French-Canadian cultural survival.
And the Patriots' organized demand for reform came to a head in 1834.
With the 92 resolutions.
Which was basically a manifesto.
A massive, detailed shopping list of political grievances and reforms, backed by an enormous number of signatures, nearly 90,000. And it was not polite. The tone reflected this deep, explosive frustration.
It had thinly veiled threats of rebellion.
It was essentially saying, give us democratic control or this will end badly. They controlled the majority of the assembly, but they had zero functional power, and this was their attempt to force the hand of the British crown.
So how did Britain respond to this organized democratic demand?
The reply came in March 1837. Lord John Russell delivered the infamous 10 resolutions.
And they were not receptive.
Devastatingly succinct. The British government rejected virtually all of the Patriots' demands. And, to add insult to injury, they gave the appointed executive the power to seize control of colonial revenues without the consent of the Assembly.
Which gutted the Assembly's last financial power.
Their last real lever. That absolute refusal hardened all the divisions. It convinced the radical reformers that peaceful constitutional change was completely impossible.
The 10 resolutions were the point of no return.
It pushed the colonies steeply down the slope toward armed civil strife.
And so we get the brief but bloody 1837-38 uprisings in both Canadas. Let's start with Lower Canada.
The Lower Canada Rebellion was short-lived but incredibly intense. After some initial success at Saint-Denis, where the Patriots actually defeated a British force, the British response was just overwhelming.
They suspended the Constitution,
Declared martial law, executed rebels immediately. In the Richelieu Valley, they enacted collective punishment, burning entire villages and farm buildings to the ground.
The brutality at the Church of St. Eustache often stands out as a symbol of that repression.
It was decisive and horrific. A force of about 200 Patriot rebels took refuge inside the church. They were defeated by a vastly superior British force, who then set the church on fire.
Oh my God.
Nearly half the rebels died, and historical accounts state that some were literally burned alive in the church after it was set ablaze by the British troops. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a brutal assertion of imperial authority.
Upriver, in Upper Canada, the revolt was even shorter, led by William Lyon Mackenzie, the printing press guy.
Culminating in that disastrous failed march on Montgomery's Tavern. Mackenzie was a firebrand, but a terrible military planner. His rebellion was put down almost instantly.
And the aftermath revealed the vindictive nature of the family compact.
In Toronto, 9 rebels were hanged publicly. Over 100 were subjected to transportation, meaning they were exiled to penal colonies in Australia, a fate often described as worse than death.
But the Republican sentiment didn't die out completely.
No. Exiles even retreated to Navy Island on the Niagara River and declared a provisional Canadian republic, but their subsequent invasion attempt failed.
It's striking, though, that while the Canadas were engulfed in violence and repression, other British North American colonies managed to achieve similar political concessions without bloodshed.
This is a critical nuance, the Maritimes specifically.
Right. Joseph Howe in Nova Scotia.
Howe was a master politician. He used the chaos in the Canadas as leverage, but he never allowed his cause for responsible government to be mistaken for republicanism or violent revolution.
So the intense pressure and alarm from the rebellions in the Canadas actually helped him.
It convinced the colonial office that granting reform in places like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick was a necessary price to pay to avoid a full-scale continental revolution. They achieved control of their own money bills and got executive responsibility earlier.
So they demonstrated that constitutional change could be achieved through sustained nonviolent pressure.
Even if that pressure was ultimately amplified by the blood being spilled elsewhere. Precisely. Their incremental, nonviolent march toward reform gave them greater credibility and stability.
Okay, so the rebellions failed militarily, but they absolutely succeeded in getting Britain's complete, urgent attention.
They did. And London's response was to dispatch a very high-profile, influential figure, John Lambton, the first Earl of Durham.
Radical Jack.
Radical Jack, to investigate the source of these persistent colonial problems.
And his investigation results in the famous Durham Report of 1839, a pivotal document.
It's remarkable because he spent almost all his time in Lower Canada, barely visited Upper Canada at all, yet his analysis was incredibly sharp.
He correctly identified two fundamental problems, right?
Yes. He attributed the colonial problems to, one, the bitter ethnic animosity between the French and English populations, which he found insurmountable under the current structure, and two, crucially, the lack of what he termed responsible government.
He understood that as long as the appointed oligarchy could ignore the elected assembly, there would be perpetual unrest.
Exactly. But his solution was dual, and one half of it was incredibly controversial and antagonistic to the French population.
He had two main recommendations.
First, the Union of the Canadas, and second, the introduction of responsible government. He saw the first as the cure for the ethnic problem, and the second as the cure for the constitutional problem.
Let's focus on the Union first. We need to be clear. His goal here was overtly assimilationist.
Absolutely. The report contained some truly shocking language. Durham explicitly sought to eliminate the French fact
By creating a unified British majority.
His plan was to merge the two Canadas and create equal representation. 42 seats for Canada East, which was Lower Canada and the French majority, and 42 seats for Canada West, Upper Canada, the English minority.
Despite the French Canadians having a larger population at the time.
Right. The plan was to dilute their power. Not just dilute it, to crush it.
How?
It was a three-pronged attack. First, equal representation meant the French majority would always be swamped by the British voting bloc. Second, Lower Canada, which had a robust treasury, would be forced to absorb Upper Canada's massive, crushing colonial debts from canal building.
And third,
The flood of new British immigrants was expected to assimilate the Francophone population politically and culturally. Durham infamously described French culture as one without history, and therefore having no legitimate claim on survival in the progressive British Empire.
wow.
It's an incredibly harsh language.
So Britain agrees to the Union part, but initially rejects the responsible government part.
Right, out of fear of imperial disintegration. So we get the Act of Union in 1841.
Which creates one large colony, the province of Canada, and one single legislature. The assimilationists got their equal representation, and English was made the sole language of record and legislative debate.
Which was a huge slap in the face to the French-Canadian political class.
But the assimilation didn't entirely succeed. It created a political stalemate almost immediately. How did French culture survive that assault?
It survived because the assimilationists failed to remove certain non-negotiable cultural elements. The Act preserved the French civil law, the Coutume de Paris, in Canada East for property and civil rights.
It also preserved the seigneurial system and the Catholic Church.
And those institutions acted as powerful bulwarks against total assimilation. The Act of Union, ironically, ended up preserving the very cultural fault lines it was designed to erase.
And here's where we get to the true genius of Canadian political history. The systematic subversion of that assimilation goal.
That came in 1842 with the emergence of the English-French Reform Alliance.
La Fontaine and Baldwin.
Louis Hippolyte La Fontaine, the dominant Canadian reformer, realized the French population alone could not achieve responsible government. So he formed a political alliance with Robert Baldwin, the leading Canada West reformer, and Francis Hincks. It was a masterstroke of cross-cultural, cross-linguistic collaboration.
And this alliance essentially wielded a majority in the new legislature. What did that force the British governor to do?
The governor, Sir Charles Bagot, was a pragmatic realist. He felt he had no choice but to recognize this new reality. He was forced to appoint the LaFontaine-Baldwin alliance to the Executive Council.
Which was unprecedented.
Totally. Bagot privately conceded the game was up. He wrote back to the Colonial Office that whether the doctrine of responsible government was openly acknowledged or is only tacitly acquiesced in, virtually it exists.
So the reformers used their legislative majority to compel the governor, defying the Colonial Office's initial decree.
They did. This was the practical achievement of responsible government years before it was formalized. The executive could not rule without the confidence of the elected assembly.
So let's officially define what this responsible government finally meant when it was formally proclaimed between 1848 and 1849.
The definition is simple but revolutionary in a colonial context. It is the principle that the Executive Council, the cabinet, must be composed of members who have the confidence of the elected assembly.
So if the executive loses that majority approval,
They have to be dismissed, and you get new elections or a new cabinet.
that reversed the entire flow of political authority.
Absolutely. Authority no longer flowed vertically from the crown or the appointed governor, but horizontally from the voters, through their elected assembly and then into the executive. It established a truly self-governing model within the larger British Empire.
And what was the key definitive event that tested this new system? The thing that showed everyone, including the crown, that responsible government was real and here to stay.
That was the Rebellion Losses Bill of 1849. The LaFontaine-Baldwin government proposed a bill to compensate people in Canada East for property losses suffered during the rebellions.
Including those who had participated in the rebellion but weren't convicted of treason.
Exactly. It was essentially amnesty and compensation for their political rivals, a truly controversial test of power.
So they were politically forcing the Governor-General, Lord Elgin, to accept the law he personally despised.
That's it. Elgin hated the bill. The Anglophone Tory population of Montreal viewed it as compensating rebels and rewarding treason. But because the bill had passed the elected assembly, the principle of responsible government demanded that Elgin, as the representative of the crown, had to sign it into law.
Despite his personal disagreement and the fury of the Tory elite?
Yes. And what was the immediate furious reaction of that defeated Château Clique?
A riot.
A visceral reaction. Mobs of Anglophone Tories gathered in Montreal, and after Lord Elgin signed the bill, they rioted. They attacked Elgin's carriage, and then, most dramatically, they descended upon the Parliament buildings in Montreal and burned them to the ground.
The Parliament of the new province of Canada was literally burned down because the governor followed the rules of responsible government.
That's the irony and the definitive moment. Elgin stood firm. He refused to call in the military to revoke the law, refused to be intimidated. By allowing this political firestorm to happen without overriding the elected government, he affirmed that responsible government was irreversible.
The power now lay with the voters, not the mob or the governor.
And this willingness to concede self-government was greatly accelerated by a shift in British imperial philosophy. It wasn't purely altruism.
Right. Britain was abandoning its centuries-old mercantile system.
For a new economic philosophy. Laissez-faire capitalism. They repealed the Protective Navigation Acts. Colonies were no longer essential as closed, exclusive mercantile markets.
So in this new global free trade environment, granting political autonomy to the colonies was far less threatening to an empire focused on global financial dominance.
Exactly. Canadian demands for self-rule suddenly worked to the economic advantage of the empire.
And the dam broke. The rollout was swift.
Nova Scotia formally proclaimed responsible government in 1848. Then New Brunswick and the province of Canada in 1849, despite the riots. PEI in 51 and Newfoundland in 55.
So by the mid-1850s, self-governance was the established standard across British North America.
It was.
Now that we've charted the political maturity of the East, let's go back to the West and see what the political situation was like for the newly empowered Métis Nation under that post-1821 monopoly.
Life under the new, unified Hudson's Bay Company monopoly run by the aggressive George Simpson became significantly harder for everyone who wasn't part of the corporate hierarchy.
Because the NWC was gone, right? The competition that allowed indigenous peoples and the Métis to play the companies off each other for better trade terms just vanished.
Exactly. Simpson imposed these harsh, purely profit-driven rules. This meant tight limitations on credit. You couldn't rack up debt to trade, which was the traditional way of doing business.
And there were cuts to those ceremonial presents.
Deep cuts. Those presents had historically reaffirmed alliances, but Simpson just saw them as wasteful expenditure. The trading relationship was reduced to a transactional minimum.
Yet, despite the lack of formal political recognition from the HBC, the Métis Nation had developed this incredibly robust, independent system of self-governance out on the plains.
It's such a contrast to the oligarchy still ruling the Red River settlement.
It really is.
They had a system of self-rule that was highly sophisticated and adaptable. And this system centered entirely on the biannual communal buffalo hunt.
Which took place every June and September.
And it was a necessity for survival, but also a political organization in motion.
What was the structure of this moving government?
It was almost a military democracy. The massive hunting expedition, sometimes over 1,200 people, hundreds of carts, thousands of horses, was highly structured.
They elected a chief.
They elected a chief, or president of the hunt. 10 captains and soldiers were appointed to enforce strict discipline and order. This system was based on indigenous plains culture and was essential for collective safety and economic success.
So what were the famous laws of the hunt like?
They were minute and necessary for survival. Things like no hunting on the Sabbath, no separating from the group once the line of march was formed, and most crucially, no running the buffalo or hunting before the chief gave the precise order.
Because violating those rules endangered everyone.
You'd spook the herd and risk mass casualties.
What were the punishments for infractions?
They were designed to maintain social pressure and order. They ranged from public humiliation to highly specific financial penalties. If you ran the buffalo early, your saddle and bridle were cut up.
If you stole.
You were banished. If you separated from the main group, you were stripped of your horse for the duration. These laws reflected a mixed heritage, but emphasized collective security over individual gain.
And this communal system reinforced a powerful cultural ethic of spontaneous sharing, right?
Yes. Sharing wasn't charity. It was fundamental to nationhood and survival. It was unstructured and immediate.
Driven by the absolute knowledge that starvation was a constant visitor.
And that a rich hunter today might be starving tomorrow. One famous hunter noted that if he failed to help a neighbor who had nothing, he would feel just dead inside. That sense of interconnectedness was the social contract of the plains.
The irony here is incredible. The Métis had their own successful elected discipline systems for survival on the plains.
But Red River itself, the geographical center of their existence, was still governed by an imposed oligarchy.
The political structure at Red River, the colony, was dictated entirely by the appointed Council of Assiniboia.
Created by the HBC in 1835. And this council was composed of appointed HBC officials and retirees, serving the interests of the company, not the residents. It was the same oligarchical, unrepresentative system that the Party Patriot fought against in Lower Canada.
So the fundamental problem of unaccountable appointed power was a continental issue. It just manifested in different forms in the East and West.
Absolutely. The Métis may have been self-governing on the hunt, but their home base lacked the basic democratic representation that the East was struggling to achieve. And as the mid-19th century progressed, this nation faced immense environmental and economic pressures that threatened its very existence.
The pressure came from the destruction of their staple resource, the bison.
By the 1850s, the global market fundamentally altered the fur trade. Demand for buffalo robes grew rapidly.
These thick, luscious winter hides.
Immensely popular for carriage blankets and luxury furniture in places like New York and London, and for military gear, like gun belts for British soldiers in India. Robes, now a high premium item, began to eclipse the importance of pemmican.
How catastrophic was this shift?
Devastating. Where pemmican required the careful, sustainable hunting of bison for food, the robe trade necessitated indiscriminate slaughter for the hide alone. St. Louis, Missouri alone was receiving 200,000 hides annually.
An impending environmental catastrophe.
Absolutely. The bison herds at the eastern margin of the plains were hunted to extinction. This forced the Métis to travel farther and farther afield.
The hunting lines grew too long to easily return to Red River.
Which forced the creation of the hivernants, or winter camps, farther and farther west, sometimes hundreds of miles from the settlement. This movement and concentration escalated into ethnic conflict.
You see growing Sioux antagonism.
And severe tensions with the Plains Cree, as everyone was now competing over a shrinking finite resource. As one historian, Alexander Ross, noted, the bison herds were increasingly like a ball between two players, constantly being chased and pressured from all sides.
And this economic desperation only compounded the growing political frustration with the HBC monopoly, which finally met its symbolic end in 1849.
The Sayre trial. Pierre Sayre, a Métis man, was arrested and tried for illicit trading, violating the HBC's charter rights to monopoly.
And the HBC technically won the legal case.
They did. But the trial was held in the presence of hundreds of armed Métis hunters. The jury, intimidated by the sheer political show of force, recommended clemency. The result was a political victory for the Métis.
The commercial reality had changed.
Yes, the trial affirmed the commercial reality that trade was effectively open across the West, regardless of the old charter. It broke the HBC's economic stranglehold and was a massive precursor to the eventual transfer of Rupert's Land to the new country of Canada.
Because the HBC could no longer effectively govern or control the territory.
They just couldn't.
So what does this all mean when we put the two halves of the continent back together? We've charted two profoundly different yet equally intense experiences between 1815 and 1860. Political maturation in the East and national, social, and environmental collapse in the West.
It creates a The executive was finally made responsible to the elected assembly, essentially solving the constitutional crisis that led to the rebellions. But just as the East gained control of its own destiny, the West, where the Métis Nation had solidified its distinct identity, was simultaneously entering a period of catastrophic environmental and economic collapse due to the hyper-exploitation of the bison herds.
And even in the East, that new political arrangement, the Act of Union that created the province of Canada, was incredibly unstable despite responsible government. The assimilationist goals had failed.
And the political system was built on a lie, that two culturally different peoples could be governed by equal but ultimately antagonistic representation.
Historians look at the 1850s, the decade right after responsible government, not as a period of triumph,
but as one dominated by stalemates and failures. The political system was plagued by deadlock. The French-English divide, Canada East and Canada West, meant that virtually no legislation could pass without a double majority.
And governments fell constantly.
Constantly. New parties were emerging, unable to govern effectively.
The system was designed to unite, but it only institutionalized the division, leading to parliamentary gridlock. So the question we have to ask you, the listener, as we wrap up, why did this newly formed semi-autonomous province of Canada, which had just achieved self-government after decades of struggle, suddenly decide in the early 1860s that the entire constitutional arrangement was unworkable?
And that they needed to scrap the whole thing and create a brand new country called Canada. The pressure wasn't just internal political deadlock, although that was severe. The fear of external power was paramount.
The United States.
The United States had just concluded its devastating civil war, resulting in a massive, standing, experienced army and an immediate threat of northern expansion. That external military pressure, combined with the urgent need to secure and stabilize the collapsing Western economy, which was now up for grabs after the Sayre trial, it forced politicians to seek a drastic continental cure-all.
They had to act immediately.
To centralize power and expand westward, or risk being absorbed entirely by their powerful neighbor.
That urgency, that collision of internal deadlock and external threat is where we pick up next time as we dive into the unlikely negotiations and the dramatic political birth of Confederation.